700 years ago, a ship pulled into the port of Messina, Sicily. It was October 1347. The sailors on board were either dead or covered in black, oozing boils the size of eggs. The harbour officials immediately ordered the ships out, but it was already too late. Within days, people in Messina started dying. And not slowly. We're talking 3 to 5 days from the first symptom to death. The disease moved like nothing Europe had ever seen, and nobody, not a single doctor, priest or king, had any idea what was coming. What happened next was the single greatest demographic catastrophe in recorded human history. By the time it was over, somewhere between 30 and 60% of Europe's entire population was dead. In some cities, that number hit 80%. Streets that were once full of merchants, children, and music became mass graves. Bodies piled up faster than people could bury them. Medieval people called it the Great Mortality. We call it the Black Death. But here's the question that haunted historians for nearly 700 years. Where did it actually come from? People blamed poisoned wells. They blamed the alignment of planets. They blamed Jewish communities, leading to some of the worst pogroms in medieval history. Others believed it was the wrath of God, a divine punishment for humanity's sins. The Church had no answers. Physicians had no answers. Nobody had answers. And then, in 2022, a team of scientists did something nobody thought was possible. They extracted ancient DNA, literally pulling genetic material from the teeth of people who died over 680 years ago. And what they found didn't just answer the question of where the Black Death started. It answered a question scientists had been arguing about for decades. The evidence was locked inside a graveyard nobody had visited since the 1880s, in a mountain region most people couldn't find on a map. This is the story of how DNA cracked one of history's greatest cold cases. How a bacteria born in the grasslands of Central Asia became the deadliest killer in human history, and what it left behind, permanently, in the genes of every person alive in Europe today. Stay with us, because this investigation goes deeper than you think. In 1885, a Russian archaeologist named Daniel Chwolson was excavating near Lake Izikul, a massive glacial lake sitting high in the mountains of what is now Kyrgyzstan, Central Asia. It's one of the most remote places on Earth, surrounded by the Tian Shan mountain range, ancient, cold, and silent. What he found there was unusual. A graveyard. And the headstones weren't ordinary. They were carved with inscriptions in Syriac, the language of a medieval Christian community called the Nestorians, who had spread across Central Asia centuries earlier. He documented everything and moved on. The graves were resealed. And for the next 140 years, nobody paid much attention to them. Until 2 researchers, Phil Slavin from the University of Stirling and Johannes Krauss from the Max Planck Institute, started asking a specific question. Were these people connected to the Black Death? Here's why that question mattered. The epidemic didn't hit Europe until 1347, but the inscriptions on those Kyrgyzstan gravestones were dated 1338 and 1339. That's 8 years earlier. And one of the inscriptions said something that made the researchers stop cold. It said the people buried there had died of pestilence. Not old age, not war, pestilence. That word, in that region, in those years, it was a breadcrumb pointing straight to the origin of everything. The team was able to obtain ancient skeletal remains that had been collected in the 1880s and stored in museum collections in St. Petersburg and Bishkek. They didn't have to dig up new graves. The bones had been sitting in boxes for over a century. The question now was whether DNA had survived inside those bones, specifically inside the teeth, because the dental pulp cavity, sealed inside hard enamel, is like a biological time capsule. If bacteria ever entered the bloodstream, which Y. pestis absolutely does, traces of its DNA can survive in that pulp for centuries, under the right conditions. These graves sat in a high-altitude mountain region, cold, dry. Perfect preservation conditions. The team extracted the samples. They sent them to the ancient DNA labs in Germany. And then they waited. The results, when they came
back, were going to change everything we thought we knew about where the Black Death began. Ancient DNA is not like the DNA in a fresh crime scene. It's degraded, fragmented, contaminated with fungal and bacterial material from centuries of decomposition. Extracting usable genetic material from an 800-year-old tooth is an extraordinarily delicate process. The lab doing this work was the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology in Leipzig, Germany. These are the same scientists who had previously sequenced the Neanderthal genome. If anyone could pull ancient plague DNA from medieval teeth, it was them. And they did. The DNA confirmed it. The people buried at that Kyrgyzstan graveyard in 1338 and 1339 had died with Yersinia pestis, the bacteria that causes plague, in their bloodstreams. But that wasn't even the most important finding. What the team discovered next was the actual smoking gun. They compared the genetic sequence of this ancient Y. pestis strain against every other known plague strain in the historical and modern record. What they found was that the Kyrgyzstan bacteria sat right at the base of the evolutionary tree, a Big Bang diversification point. In plain language, this was the ancestor, the source, the original strain from which all subsequent Black Death variants descended. The debate was over. The Black Death did not originate in China, as some historians had theorized. It did not come from India. It came from Central Asia, from the foothills of the Tian Shan Mountains, near a glacial lake that most people in the modern world have never heard of. Now, how did a bacteria from one of the most remote places on Earth spread to kill nearly a third of all humans alive at the time? That answer lives on the Silk Road. But before we get there, think about what this moment represents scientifically. A team of researchers extracted DNA from bones that a Russian archaeologist collected in 1885 without knowing what he was really holding. Those bones sat in a museum for 140 years, and in 2022 they gave us the clearest answer yet to a mystery that has haunted civilization since the 14th century. Science doesn't always move fast, but when it does move, it can reach back 700 years. The Silk Road was not one road. It was a vast network of trade routes stretching from China through Central Asia, across Persia, through the Middle East, and into Europe. For centuries, it was the main artery of global commerce, carrying silk, spices, precious metals, and ideas between civilizations that had almost no other contact with each other. It was also, it turns out, the perfect highway for a microscopic killer. Here's how the biology worked. Yersinia pestis lived primarily in the bodies of wild rodents, marmots, ground squirrels, gerbils, across the steppe grasslands of Central Asia. This is its natural reservoir. The rodents don't die from it, they carry it, and the fleas that feed on them carry it too. When rodent populations are disrupted, by climate shifts, by drought, by human encroachment, infected fleas start jumping to other hosts, including rats. And rats, as history knows very well, tend to follow human beings everywhere they go. The marmot, in particular, was a key vector. Central Asian steppe cultures hunted marmots for their fur and meat. A hunter who skinned an infected marmot could pick up plague-infected fleas immediately. And that hunter might then travel to a trading post. The Mongol Empire, which by the 14th century stretched from Korea to Eastern Europe, had created something unprecedented, a connected corridor of trade and movement across the entire Eurasian continent. Caravans moved constantly, armies moved constantly, and where armies and caravans went, rats went too. There's a specific moment in the spread of the Black Death that deserves attention. In 1346, Mongol forces were besieging the Genoese trading city of Kaffa on the Crimean Peninsula, on the northern shore of the Black Sea. The Mongol camp was devastated by plague. According to a contemporary account written by a Genoese notary named Gabriele de Musis, the Mongols began catapulting the bodies of their plague dead over the walls and into the city. Historians debate how much biological impact this actually had. But what's not debated is what happened next. The Genoese merchants fled by ship. They sailed back to Italy, and they brought the plague with
them. DNA analysis has now confirmed the genetic trail, tracking strain variants from Central Asia westward through the Black Sea region into the Mediterranean and then exploding across Europe in a wave pattern that matches perfectly with what the historical records described. The Silk Road didn't just trade silk, it traded death. In 1986, construction workers in East Smithfield, in the heart of London, hit something unexpected underground. Bones, thousands of them, layer upon layer of human remains, carefully arranged in rows. They had found one of London's emergency burial grounds from the Black Death, a site specifically ordered by King Edward III in 1348 to handle the overwhelming number of corpses that London's regular churchyards simply could not accommodate. What struck archaeologists immediately was the organization. The bodies weren't just thrown in, they were laid in rows, aligned, some wrapped. Even in the middle of catastrophic pandemic, the living had tried to preserve some dignity for the dead. It told you something about the people doing the burying, that they were still thinking, still caring, still trying. The site eventually yielded the skeletal remains of over 600 individuals, and modern DNA analysis turned this London graveyard into one of the most important datasets in plague research. Here's what the sequencing showed. When researchers compared the Y. pestis DNA extracted from the London victims' teeth against the DNA taken from the Kyrgyzstan graveyard victims, the ones who died 8 years earlier, thousands of miles away, the strains were nearly identical. Nearly 100% match. The same bacteria, the same killer. Traced from a mountain lake in Central Asia to the streets of medieval London in under a decade. Among the London remains, archaeologists found one burial that became a powerful symbol. A young girl, estimated to be between 11 and 15 years old. She was buried with a small number of gold coins placed with her body. The coins suggest she came from a wealthy or at least prosperous family. It didn't matter. The plague didn't care about wealth. It didn't care about class, about family name, about how beautiful your house was or how powerful your father was. In the 1340s, if the flea found you, you died. The DNA from the London victims also gave scientists a window into something else,
the biological state of the people who were dying. Analysis of their skeletal remains showed signs of nutritional stress, evidence of prior disease, and low immune resilience. Europe in the mid-1300s had just come through decades of famine caused by a period of climate cooling. The population was already weakened. The plague didn't just find victims, it found perfect victims. To understand the Black Death, you have to try to imagine what it felt like to live through it, not as a statistic, as a person. You wake up one morning and your neighbor is fine. By afternoon, they have a swelling under their armpit the size of an apple, hard, hot, agonizing to touch. By the next evening, they're feverish, hallucinating. By the morning after that, they're dead. And you watched it happen through your window. Because by then, you knew better than to go near them. Medieval physicians were not helpless. They were intelligent, educated people working within a medical framework that simply had no concept of germ theory. They believed in miasma, the idea that disease spread through bad air, particularly air that smelled foul. The treatment was logical by their standards. Burn aromatic herbs, carry flowers, avoid swamps and rotting material. One of the most visually striking figures of this era is the plague doctor. Hired by cities specifically to treat plague victims, they wore long, wax-coated robes, gloves, a wide-brimmed hat, and a beaked mask. Inside the beak, dried herbs and flowers intended to filter the bad air. It was a hazmat suit built from medieval logic, and it almost certainly didn't work. But here's what's remarkable. The beak mask actually did provide some protection, not from miasma, but from flea bites. A flea is unlikely to bite through a wax-coated robe. The medieval doctors who survived the plague probably survived in part because their costume, designed for the wrong reason, happened to do the right thing. DNA research has confirmed exactly what happened inside the body when Y. pestis entered the bloodstream. The bacteria would replicate in the lymph nodes, causing the characteristic buboes, those swollen masses in the groin, armpit, and neck. Then it would enter the blood itself, causing septicemic plague. In some cases, it reached the lungs, becoming pneumonic plague, which spread not through fleas at all, but through droplets in the air. When researchers extracted DNA from dental pulp of victims, they found bacterial genetic material even there, in the blood supply of the teeth. The infection had spread throughout the entire body, right up until the last breath. The social fabric of medieval Europe collapsed in a way that is almost incomprehensible to describe. People fled their families. Parents abandoned sick children. Priests refused to give last rites. Giovanni Boccaccio, who survived the 1348 outbreak in Florence, wrote that fathers and mothers refused to nurse and assist their own children. He wasn't exaggerating. He watched it happen. The group called the Flagellants traveled across Europe in processions, publicly whipping themselves with spiked leather straps. They believed the only way to stop the plague was to suffer publicly, to show God they were repentant. They attracted massive crowds. They also spread the plague to every town they passed through. This was a world where the explanation for catastrophe was spiritual, and without the right explanation, there was no right response. Not everyone died. This seems obvious. Clearly some people survived because Europeans still exist. But for a long time, historians assumed survival was mostly about luck. Wrong place, right time. Didn't encounter an infected flea. Left the city early enough. DNA research has revealed something far more interesting. In 2022, a study published in the journal Nature, using ancient DNA samples from before, during, and after the Black Death, identified specific genetic variants that appear to have conferred real biological protection against Y. pestis. The key gene is called ERAP2. ERAP2 is involved in the immune system's ability to recognize and present fragments of pathogens to other immune cells. Think of it like a biological ID scanner. People with a specific variant of this gene, called haplotype N, were significantly more likely to survive Y. pestis infection. Their immune systems were better at identifying the bacteria and triggering an effective response. When researchers compared the frequency of this ERAP2 variant in ancient DNA samples from before the Black Death versus after it, the numbers told a striking story. After the pandemic swept through, the N haplotype was dramatically more common in the population. The survivors, the people who went on to have children, whose descendants are alive today, were disproportionately the ones who had this genetic variant. This is evolution happening in real time. A pandemic so severe, so fast, so lethal that it visibly shifted the genetic makeup of an entire continent's population within just a few generations. But evolution doesn't give anything for free. The same ERAP2 variant that helped people survive the Black Death has a trade-off. Carriers of this gene today are at significantly higher risk for autoimmune diseases, conditions where the immune system attacks the body's own tissue. Crohn's disease, rheumatoid arthritis, lupus. The immune system that was calibrated to fight Y. pestis is, centuries later, somewhat prone to false alarms. Your body's extraordinary plague defense occasionally misidentifies your own intestinal lining as an enemy. You are, in a very literal sense, carrying the genetic legacy of people who survived one of the worst events in human history. The Black Death didn't just kill people, it edited the human genome. Here's something that will reframe everything you thought you understood about the Black Death. The bacteria didn't start out as a killer. Modern ancient DNA analysis has found traces of Yersinia pestis in human remains dating back over 5,000 years, deep into the Neolithic era, the Stone Age. This bacteria was infecting people long before the medieval world existed, long before the Roman Empire, long before the pyramids were built. But those early versions of Y. pestis were fundamentally different from the strain that caused the Black Death. The prehistoric versions of the bacteria lacked a critical gene called YMT, short for Yersinia murine toxin. This gene is what allows
modern Y. pestis to survive inside the gut of a flea. Without YMT, the bacteria can't live in the flea's digestive system. It can't be transmitted by flea bites. The prehistoric version of plague was probably spread through direct contact, maybe through handling infected animals, maybe through contaminated water. At some point, scientists estimate somewhere around 3,000 to 4,000 years ago, the bacteria acquired YMT, possibly through horizontal gene transfer, where bacteria can pick up DNA from other bacteria in their environment. That single genetic acquisition changed everything. Now, Y. pestis could live inside fleas. Now fleas could carry it and inject it directly into the bloodstream with every bite. Now the bacteria had a mobile, abundant, nearly invisible vector that lived alongside rats, which lived alongside humans everywhere on Earth. One gene. That's the difference between a pathogen that causes occasional local outbreaks and a pathogen that kills 200 million people. DNA analysis has mapped the entire evolutionary family tree of Y. pestis, tracing every major pandemic back to a series of divergence points, moments where the bacterial population split into new strains. The Justinianic plague of the 6th century, which devastated the Byzantine Empire, was caused by a related but distinct strain. The Black Death was a separate branch, and a third pandemic, which began in China in the 1850s and spread globally, was yet another branch from the same family tree. The bacteria is still out there. That's not a metaphor.
Why pestis currently exists in wild rodent populations across the American Southwest. Prairie dogs, ground squirrels, chipmunks. It exists in rodent populations across Central Asia, Africa, and parts of South America. Public health authorities monitor it. There are a handful of human plague cases in the United States every single year. We have antibiotics now. Early treatment is highly effective. But the bacteria hasn't gone anywhere. It's waiting. The Black Death killed, by most estimates, somewhere between 30 and 50% of Europe's population between 1347 and 1353. In some regions, parts of Italy, southern France, Spain, the mortality rate may have reached 60 or even 80%. Think about what that actually means for a society. Fields stopped being harvested because there weren't enough farmers. Entire villages simply ceased to exist, not destroyed by war, just emptied. Sheep wandered ownerless across the English countryside. Unfinished buildings stood half-constructed for decades. In some towns, survivors had to move into houses that belonged to people who had died because their own neighborhood was gone. And then something unexpected happened. The workers who survived, the peasants, the laborers, the craftsmen, suddenly had enormous bargaining power. Before the plague, labor was cheap because people were plentiful. After the plague, every lord needed farm workers, and there weren't enough of them. Wages went up. Serfs began demanding and receiving better conditions. In England, this labor unrest eventually contributed to the Peasants' Revolt of 1381. The feudal system, which had organized European society for centuries, began to crack. Not because of an ideology, because of a bacteria. The city of Venice, which had one of the highest death tolls in Europe given its dense population and active port, also pioneered one of history's most important public health innovations. In 1377, the city of Ragusa, modern Dubrovnik, introduced the first formal quarantine, a mandatory 30-day isolation period for ships and travelers arriving from plague-affected regions. Venice extended this to 40 days, which is where we get the word quarantine, from the Italian quarantino, meaning 40 days. This was rational, systematic, evidence-based public health policy developed in the 14th century. Not perfect, but genuinely effective. The cities that implemented strict quarantine survived at higher rates than those that didn't. DNA analysis has also revealed the migration patterns that followed the Black Death. As populations in some regions were wiped out almost entirely, genetic signatures show that people moved, filling in the empty spaces left by the dead. New family lines established themselves in towns where old family lines had simply ended. The plague reshaped the genetic geography of an entire continent. And out of the devastation, slowly, something new began to emerge. The labor shortages drove investment in tools and techniques that reduced the need for manual work. Wealth concentrated in fewer hands, and those hands spent it on art, on architecture, on scholarship. The intellectual ferment that followed the Black Death, the questioning of established authority, the crisis of faith in the Church's explanations, helped set the conditions for the Renaissance. History's greatest catastrophe became the fertilizer for one of history's greatest cultural flowerings. Let's bring this all the way back to where we started, and then forward to where you're sitting right now. In 2022, a team of scientists published a paper in the journal Nature that confirmed what the Kyrgyzstan DNA had revealed. The Black Death originated near Lake Izhik-Kul in what is now Kyrgyzstan. It diverged from a common ancestor strain right around 1338, the same years carved on those gravestones that a Russian archaeologist found and mostly forgot about in 1885. 700 years of mystery, solved by 2 sets of teeth from a mountain graveyard. That is what ancient DNA science is capable of, and it's still in its early stages. Here is what this story means for you specifically. If your ancestry traces back to Europe, to the UK, to Germany, to Scandinavia, to France, to Italy, to anywhere on that continent, then you are, with near certainty, descended from people who survived the Black Death. Not all of your ancestors survived. Many of them didn't. But some did. And those who survived may have done so, at least in part, because they carried specific genetic variants, like that ERAP2 haplotype, that made them more resistant to Yersinia pestis. That resistance is in you, right now, in the cells of your immune system. The trade-off, the elevated risk of autoimmune conditions, is in you too. Your body's extraordinary talent for fighting off certain infections came with a price that was paid in an entirely different century for an entirely different reason. This is what the DNA record shows us. History is not just something that happened to other people in other times. It happened to the specific biological line that produced you. The Black Death didn't just kill 200 million people. It selected which people would have children. It shaped which genes would survive into the future. It wrote itself into the biology of every person alive in the Western world today. The scientists who cracked this case, researchers at Max Planck, at the University of Stirling, at dozens of labs working with ancient skeletal collections, have given us something extraordinary. Not just the answer to where the Black Death came from, but a window into how disease shapes civilization. How a single genetic mutation in a bacteria can redirect the course of human history. How the past is not dead. It is alive in us, written in a language we are only now learning to read. COVID-19 reminded the modern world of something the 14th century already knew, that a pathogen does not respect borders, does not respect wealth, does not respect the certainty of people who believe they are safe. The Black Death story is not a medieval story. It is a human story, and its final chapter has not been written yet, because Yersinia pestis is still out there. Quiet, patient, preserved in the bodies of marmots and prairie dogs and ground squirrels across the cold grasslands of Central Asia and the American Southwest, waiting, as it has always waited, for the next opportunity. The bacteria has all the time in the world, and we are the ones who have to stay ready.